Stewart Hosie.
Deputy Speaker, I've been struck by a number of things which have been said on the government side today. Firstly, the kind of mechanical usage, the almost robotic mantra of 1 million spare rooms, of under-occupancy, of utilisation, an almost frighteningly casual disregard that these are people's family homes, where they've brought up children, have lived potentially for decades, and where because of that they've created the stable, safe, supportive communities we all want to see, now to be torn asunder for the sake of a money-saving measure, and it is a money-saving measure, which will not work. You know, the thing which is extraordinary about this bedroom tax only works if the policy fails. If everybody could move to a properly sized property, in the eyes of the government, a properly sized property, then the housing benefit costs would likely be identical to what they are today. Not 1 penny would be saved. The tax will only work if people can't move and give the government the money, extra money, over and above they already pay to stay in their family homes. I'll happily give way.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman, but that is not necessarily the case, because if people who need more rooms are currently living in the private sector and move into the social housing sector, whilst the people in the social housing sector who need fewer rooms move into the private sector, there will be a substantial saving.
Unless, of course, one factors in the fact that rents in the private sector are dearer, and we've heard evidence earlier today that would rather contradict the assertion made elegantly by the honourable gentleman. One of the other things which struck me, and the honourable member for Keighley, who's not in his place, said it. He said he wanted more facts and less scaremongering. I think that's very sensible. I'm all in favour of evidence-based policy making. And what the honourable gentleman and others have then done is say there is a discretionary payment system available to help, actually confirming the fact that those who do live in specially adapted, accessible housing are not exempt, actually confirming that those families who are foster carer families are not automatically exempt, and by asking for more facts and less scaremongering, talking about discretionary payments which by their nature may not actually be available, particularly if the pot runs out, confirms the lack of exemptions here, make this bedroom tax as nasty as we on this side think it is. Yes, I'll give way to the gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, because he's making a very important point about the discretionary nature of this, particularly in relation to foster parents, because quite often they will be, I've had a foster parent who's contacted me, whose housing association contacted them to say that these rooms where people are cared for are counted as spare rooms, but didn't know anything about the existence of the discretionary payment, and reliant on at least 2 or 3 levels of communication to actually get the discretionary payment. Sure, it would be much better if foster parents were completely exempt from this.
I agree entirely, and in the meanwhile, until that happens, of course communication should be better. Of course foster caring families should be encouraged to apply now in advance, if that's possible. But you're right, the honourable gentleman's right. This should simply be scrapped, because it won't work, and so far as I can see, it is only punitive. And that's certainly the view of the Scottish Government as well, that it will have an appalling impact in families throughout Scotland, and indeed throughout the rest of the UK. And that assessment also shows that 8 out of 10 households in Scotland, as we've heard before, the ones who are set to be hit, have an adult with a recognised disability in them, which is just extraordinary. 8 out of 10, 79% actually, of the households in Scotland who are set to be hit by this contain an adult with a recognised disability. This is about as punitive as you can get. And the Minister's muttering, do they need a spare bedroom? He's using the robotic mantra again, that somehow it's evil to have a spare bedroom. There are very good reasons to have spare bedrooms, and I may come to some of them later. And I know that the Scottish Government, the Housing and Welfare Minister, has warned the UK government of the impact of this. They've highlighted the disproportionate effect on disabled people to this government and asked them to rethink their policy. Now, we did understand before the start of this debate that the Secretary of State had in fact instructed a rethink of part of this policy. And that's to be welcomed, of course. Hold on one second. But we find out we're going to have a rolling review after it starts, which won't report perhaps for 2 years after commencement. And with the numbers I have, with people with 2 spare rooms paying an extra £20 odds a week, over £1,000 a year, they could be £2,000 down before this government's review reports back and says, actually, they're not really spare at all, because one of the sons is serving in Afghanistan and can't come home to the family home because they've been forced to move. And that's the kind of issue that this government are failing to take into consideration. And the minister's still muttering, but he won't get to his feet. I'm sure when he was at university, he was more than happy to go home to his family house. Why should working class children whose parents are in houses part funded by housing benefit not be able to go home to their family home just because the nature of the tenure of the family house? That is ridiculous. There are, of course, other groups who are affected by this. Tenants who are willing to move to smaller properties and are waiting for one to become available, but will lose out in the meantime. The parents of foster children, an issue which we've spoken about, and the parents who live separately and look after their children who are not exempt, and that category concerns me greatly. I've already been contacted by a constituent, one of many. He is separated from his wife, sadly not uncommon, and he has 2 daughters in their late teens. This gentleman is so careful, he does not switch the heating on in his apartment, a very modest apartment, unless there are guests. He counts every penny. The wife has primary caring responsibility for the 2 children, but the daughters, one or both of them, stay with him up to 4 nights a week. That will become impossible without the second bedroom, and even if he could find a smaller property, it is highly unlikely, almost impossible in fact, that he'll be able to find a smaller property within the community he and the rest of the family live, meaning the relationship between him and his children will wither because contact will become far less possible. And I don't think the government actually understand the appalling impact this tax is actually going to have. But for me, and I go back to what was said earlier, the fact that 8 out of 10 households that will be hit, including an adult with a disability, is compelling evidence that the UK government must look again at this and do it quickly. As I said earlier, it wasn't just disabled people or foster carers, it was many, many others. And there are 2 specific cases I'd like to raise with the Minister. The first is that of a woman, a pensioner, who will not herself be affected, who cares for her severely disabled adult son. He lives in his own apartment. It has 2 bedrooms. Not through his fault, that's the one he was allocated. He needs cared for. He has a severe psychological condition. He needs cared for every single day. The mother carries out those caring responsibilities. If he is forced to move, the trauma in his life will be extraordinary. However, if he's also forced to move and manages to get through that episode, because his mother, who has the caring responsibilities, already also has medical conditions of her own, she will not be able to carry out her caring responsibilities if her son is forced to move even a few streets away. So the real-life impact on that family in that part of that community will be horrendous. And I'm deeply disturbed that the government haven't thought this through properly.
Just ask the honourable gentleman to confirm he is aware of the provision for a bedroom for a non-resident overnight carer.
I'm extremely well aware of that. And the thing is that the mother who cares is not permanently there overnight. She's there during the day. She may be in occasionally in the evening, but she's not a permanent overnight carer. And this goes back to the discretion rather than the proper exemption of people who have disability. I'll happily give way.
Thank you very much indeed for giving way. Have you any idea whether your constituent would meet the criteria for discretionary payment? Any indication at all?
The Minister's saying it's a right. I believe this may be a discretion, and it's not at all clear whether that particular constituent could meet the criteria for a discretionary payment. And even if they did, it depends on whether or not there's any money left in the pot. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I didn't want to speak in such general terms. I wanted to concentrate in the final 3 minutes on what's actually happening in Dundee specifically. We have figures from the Council which tell us there are 3,387 households which will be affected by this tax. Of these, 583 will lose 25% of the housing benefit. That's a loss which will have the impact of a tax. The other, no, I won't, I've only 2.5 minutes left. The other 2,804 will lose 14% of their housing benefit. Tenants in the two-bedroom council properties could lose benefit entitlement of approximately £9.93 a week. That's £516 a year. Those with two so-called spare rooms will lose an entitlement of £20.07 a week, over £1,000 a year. Does the Minister understand what the loss of £1,000 a year means to families who are already struggling to make ends meet? And does he understand the consequence of that level of indebtedness? Legitimate lending companies will not lend to people in these circumstances. Credit unions can only do so much. This policy will drive people into the hands of loan sharks and illegal moneylenders. And the consequences will be picked up by social work and health services and the police at the cost to the public purse for a policy which is unlikely to save this government any money in the first place. The anger within communities over this, if the honourable gentleman is very brief.
Yes, I will be brief. I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I attended a meeting a couple of weeks ago with officers of Dundee City Council where they said that discretionary payments would be very, very limited because they never had the funds for it. I also asked the question, do you have smaller houses to put people who are willing to move? And they said no.
Well, the honourable gentleman really sums it up quite nicely. The discretionary pot is too small. The discretion, and I don't dislike discretion generally, I think it's quite helpful, but there are too many categories who should be fully exempt, who are going to be forced into being at the tender mercies of discretionary decision-making, which may go against them when it ought not to. I think, in short, there are many people who want to speak. This remains a very bad policy, with too many of the wrong people being impacted very badly, and it must be reversed. It risks destabilising community, it disproportionately hits disabled people, it puts the burden for paying the cost of this government's economic failure on the backs of some of the poorest in society. And it tells us everything we need to know, I think, about a Tory Liberal government. Many of whom, most of whom, I suspect, and all of whom have not been poor, and more importantly, do not understand what it means to be poor in society today.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, the member for Dundee East, and to have listened to this debate. When the Nationalists have a day, it is always a reassurance to those of us who are Unionists, because by their presence in the chamber, they show how much better off we are together than being separate. So I should like to thank them for their contribution to our parliamentary democracy and hope that they will stay with us forever.